Early on in my time in Noosa, we asked the wider community to send us in questions that they'd like to ask God if they could. This question really struck a chord with me. My 54-year-old husband is dying of cancer. Why? The full question read, my husband has been struck down with terminal melanoma cancer. It's in his bones and his organs. We found out 4 months ago. He's had no idea. He had no real symptoms. He's done chemo and radiation, but now only has weeks to live as the chemo didn't work. He's only 54. Why? You can hear the pain and the anguish, can't you? The genuine confusion. It makes no sense. Why do bad things happen to good people? There were a couple of other questions along the same line. Why do children get serious illness that ends up fatal? Why is there motor neurone disease? Why is it that babies and children have to suffer abuse? Live long enough in this world and you'll have such questions. For some, it's the issue that leads them to conclude that there is no God. For an all-powerful God surely could end all suffering, and an all-loving God would end all suffering. Therefore, as suffering exists in the world, there is no God. I want to say up front, I don't have all the answers today. And of course, there is overlap with what we looked at last week. Why doesn't a good God stop a bad virus? And I urge you to go back and look at that video from last week. But just for a moment, I want to do something a little bit different today, and that is to look at other responses to this question. Turn aside from the Christian response just for a moment and ask the question in regard to other religions. How do they answer this question? And I'm indebted to the Reverend Dr. John Dixon for his material in this area. So if I was a Hindu or a Buddhist, or if I was a Muslim or even an atheist, how would I approach this question? Let's have a look firstly at the Hindu response. Hinduism is the oldest of the world's religions, and all the events in your life are a result of the way that you've lived in the past, or indeed in a past life. Karma is the universal balancing principle. So their text puts it this way: as a man acts, so he behaves, so does he become. Whatever deeds he does on earth, their rewards he reaps. So a Hindu family who has just lost a child, in that moment, it is said, they are reaping karma for their deeds in this life or a previous life. A businessman sees a beggar by the side of the road. He knows that what he is seeing is a divinely sanctioned balancing mechanism. Suffering is simply, yet profoundly, the balancing out of your deeds. So the answer to Our Lady, who was losing her 54-year-old husband to cancer, is, well, it's the opposite to the Sound of Music. Somewhere in my youth and childhood, I must have done something good. The answer is something in my youth or childhood, or in a past life, I must have done something bad. What then is the response of Buddhism? Perhaps more than any other religion, Buddhism is a response to suffering. So a prince who was over a region in the present day intersections of India and Nepal around 500 BC, lived in absolute luxury, lived a very sheltered life, had no idea what went on outside the palace. One day he did go out and he was shocked. He saw suffering, he saw evil, he even saw a corpse, he saw hunger. And he struggled to understand the meaning of this in life. He left his young wife and his newborn child behind, and for 7 years went on a search for the meaning of pain and suffering. He sat down under a tree one day, determined not to get up from his meditating until he understood pain and suffering. Eventually, he had his enlightenment. All suffering he saw was the result of the attachments that you have to things in this world: clothes, food, relationships. All suffering is a result of your attachment to these things. So the pain that a child feels at the loss of a father is because of not of the event itself, but of the child's attachment to their father. A beggar's suffering is caused by their attachment to the desire for a better life. So if a child can detach from the desire for the father, or a beggar detached from the desire for a better life, then their suffering dissolves. It becomes illusory. Now, the logic is impeccable, but is it really possible to live that way, just to divorce yourself of all those desires? Can a boy cope with the sudden loss of his dad simply put his sorrow aside, live in denial, as it were, and still carry on. So the Buddhist's answer to Our Lady's question of the pain of losing her 54-year-old husband to cancer is stop desiring your husband and you'll suffer no more. What about Islam? Islam offers a very different response. In Islam, all the events of the universe are determined by the explicit decree of Allah. So when a plane falls from the sky, or when a child has terminal cancer, it is the hand of God, the finger of God. The reason? It's unknowable and unaskable. In Islam, you find solace as you submit to Allah. In fact, the very word Islam translates as submission to the will of God. Do not ask, don't dare to question, just submit. So the Islam answer to the 54-year-old woman losing her husband to cancer simply says, well, you must not ask why, you must not question. Just know it's Allah's will and submit. Well, what about, finally, atheism? For the atheist, suffering is just the random intersection of time and space. Perhaps the world's most famous present-day atheist, Professor Richard Dawkins, puts it this way. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows or cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So the question why is overruled, and there's no one to ask the question to anyway. Pain and suffering, they claim, are evidence of God's non-existence. Except there is one problem with the atheists' two premises, that an all-powerful God could stop the suffering and an all-loving God would stop the suffering. Because even atheist philosophers acknowledge that a loving God may just have good reasons for suffering to continue for a time. So you can't use that argument to prove categorically that there is no God. But the answer to Our Lady's question, as far as the atheist is concerned, is, well, I'm sorry, it's all meaningless, there's no rhyme, there's no reason, it's blind, pitiless existence. Atheism offers nothing. So those are the alternatives. Are you reaping what you deserve? Karma. Is suffering born of desire, and the way to get rid of the suffering is to deny your desires? Is it really just a decree of God that I must not question? Or are we really staring into an abyss where there is absolutely no God and no meaning? Well, then let's ask, where does the Christian response begin? It begins with an invitation to ask. The Bible is full of people asking these sorts of questions. We read from Psalm 73 where the author asked, how come the wicked get it so good all the time? They have no struggles, their bodies are healthy and strong. Psalm 22, the writer cries out in desperate confusion, my God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Psalm 74, why have you rejected us forever, O God? Or the prophet Habakkuk, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, yet you do not listen? So the firm witness of the Bible, in fact, the encouragement of the Bible, is to cry out to God, to complain, to question, to rile. My 54-year-old husband is dying of cancer. Why is that, God? It's not fair. I don't like it. In Islam, that's blasphemy. In Christianity, it's invited. Second, the Christian response continues with an understanding that God has suffered too. That's a huge claim. But if Jesus is God turned up on earth, which is the biblical claim, then we understand that he suffered too. He wept at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, who died. He wept as he overlooked the city of Jerusalem because they did not believe. In his arrest and trial, he was beaten and mocked and ridiculed and flogged. when he faced the cruelest execution known to mankind, he said in the words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" One of the earliest letters preserved for us from the first century says that we have in Jesus someone who is able to sympathize with us in every way. So God has known, he's experienced firsthand human sorrow and sadness and loss and death. And then the Bible presents us with an understanding that God is with us in our suffering. In Psalm 23, the Lord's my shepherd. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Your rod and staff, your presence with me comforts me. Psalm 16, because God is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Or the early church leader in that other reading that we read from 2 Corinthians, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles. The God who welcomes our questions, the God who himself has known suffering, promises to be alongside us in our troubles, as close as our right hand, to comfort and strengthen us. Well, finally, the Christian response begins with an understanding that this world is not all that it once was, nor all that it will one day be. This is what we explored last week, that the world is a sad, twisted distortion of what it once was. And we saw that the Bible makes it clear that this is not what it will be in the future. That Jesus in his death and resurrection has won victory over death and all evil, and that one day all sickness, all suffering, all pain will be gone and everything will be perfect once more. God has acted to end all the suffering. He has acted, even though we still live with the implications for a time. Well, let me finish today by returning to our question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is that? Let me say what we can't know and what we can. What I can't tell you is why a particular sadness has happened to you in your life at a particular time. Nor can I tell you why it's happened to you and not someone else. But I can tell you this, that unlike the Hindu faith, it's not karma. It's not because you've deserved these sad things happening to you. And I can tell you that unlike Buddhism, no one is asking you to cast off your attachment to your husband or your pain-free life or whatever so that you'll feel better. And that unlike Islam, no one is telling you simply to submit to God and not ask that question. And that unlike atheism, it's not just some random act of meaninglessness in a pitiless existence. Out of all the worldviews, the Christian one is the one that makes best sense to me, even if we don't have all the answers. Because God welcomes your questions, your complaints. He invites you to ask, to rail against him, to tell him exactly what you think of him. And we're reminded that God has suffered too. He's known it. He's felt it. He's been there. He's been indignant. He's been humiliated. He's known great physical and emotional pain. And he promises to be right there with us in our suffering, a refuge, alongside us in the valley, as close as our right hand to comfort us. And the Christian response reminds us that this world is not all that it once was, and it's not all that it will one day be. And that all evil and everything that is utterly painful in this world has been defeated by Jesus' death and resurrection, and one day there will be a glorious new creation. That's what I know. That's what I can say. May God be very real to you in the midst of your suffering, and of very great comfort. Amen.